Going back to the promise I gave to talk, let's say, more deeply about who exactly the Hellenes were, let's start from the place, the Danaus. Now, historians also mention the Hellenes under the name Danaus or Danaan or Danaus. And they do that not as a separate Hellenic tribe, but as to refer to the Greeks as a whole. We find this in the Latin maxim, "Don't trust the Danaans, even when they bring presents." Although you may know this as "Don't trust the Greeks, even when they bring presents." Also, Homer's Iliad, Danaans, tribe of Danaus, commonly this designate the Greek forces opposed to the Trojans. The summarized myth of Danaus consists of him fleeing Egypt with his 50 daughters and establishing a new dynasty in Argos after a dispute with his brother Aegyptus, the king of Egypt. Right. His father, Danaus' father, was a person called Belus. Now, before coming to the Balkans, this family originated and were living in the Middle East. So we're talking about Semites, if you haven't noticed. One story that originated in that very same area is the story of Jacob's sons Dan. Now, he ran from his brother, who was Joseph, practically a king of Egypt in effect. His father wasn't named Belus, but his mother was named Bilhah. His descendants will be given a land by God, the Danites, a land that they will leave and start colonizing, like they did with the northern city of Dan that they established some 200 kilometers where they initially settled in the Promised Land. But also, the biblical judge Deborah, she ironically was asking what was the tribe of Dan still doing in the ships when his brothers were outside of the ships. This is found in Judges 5:17, I believe. Clearly, Dan, the tribe of Dan, the Danites, was restless and was colonizing. Now, the Hebrew alphabet pronunciation carries almost the same pronunciations as the Hellenic alphabet. This is very interesting because the mainstream believes that the person that brought the Balkanians the so-called Greek alphabet was a Phoenician in the 8th century called Cadmo. Given the similarities with the Hebrew one, it is not far-fetched to say that it was actually a Jew from the tribe of Dan that was responsible for introducing the Phoenician alphabet, which was phonetic, to the native Pelasgians in the Balkans. I mean, after all, to somebody that's all the way in the Balkans, would seem that that guy coming from Israel is coming from Phoenicia, which was a land, established long before the Israelites came into Canaan. Going by that theory, which is backed up also by the latest deciphering of the middle text of the Rosetta Stone as ancient Macedonian Slavian language, the ancient Hellenes, or the Danaans, were the ancient Hebrew tribe of Dan. They were mentioned, at least the ruling class was, or maybe took over. They were mentioned as Danaans in the middle text of the Rosetta Stone per the new deciphering, and always within the socio-religious context of the era the stone was built. Also, they were always referred to as what we now know as Hellenes. Their so-called Phoenician alphabet is actually Hebrew. If you compare the sounds between both alphabets, this would be pretty obvious. You got Aleph and then Alpha. You got Jewish Beth, you got Betha. You got Gimel, you got Gamma, etc., etc. Furthermore, in the second book of Maccabees, now listen to this. In the second book of writes to the Jewish high priest at that time to state that the Spartans have Abrahamic ancestry. Dan is is of Abrahamic descent, the tribe of Dan. Spartans had child sacrifices as well, just as Hebrew had in Canaan. To push on this a little bit further, the famous Minoa, the guy from Crete, called Minoa, that coincides with the time Deborah was actually complaining about the tribe of Dan being in the ships, alluding that they were colonizing, is very much a variation of the Hebrew person of Manoah, who was a father of Samson, the strongest man in Jewish history, a Jewish hero. These were also Danites, Manoah and Samson, from the tribe of Dan. Now, one also interesting fact is that ancient Jews had an incident with brave 300 men chosen by God. Even further, listen to this. Hezekiah states, and Aristotle confirms, that the people called Eli and Seli, there were people that were called Eli and Seli, later known as Hellenes, came at Dodona, at Olympus, where they established the Olympic Games, and that they came from Egypt, carrying the rites of the Ark. Sorry, WinZip. What are we talking about here? What kind? The Ark of the Covenant. How can Egyptians? Well, they were coming from Egypt, but how can How can they carry the rites of an ark? Makes no sense. But they also carried stories of great flood. As mentioned, Aristotle states that they were called Eli, which even in modern Macedonian would mean those who belong to El. El is a Hebrew generic word for God. The term Seli, that Aristotle also mentions, has a meaning for someone that migrates even in modern Macedonian language. Not Greek one, but the modern Macedonian Slavian language. Now, Agamemnon. You ready for this? Agamemnon is an Egyptian name with a Hebrew prefix. We have Aga, which is Pir, a symbol of strength and longevity in Hebrew. And then we got Memnon, which is a classical ancient Egyptian name. Last but not least, Hellas, which refers for Greece, has only intelligible meaning under the Hebrew language. Not even Greeks know the etymological meaning of Hellas. Just as Boaz in Hebrew means in strength, from Bo, which is in, and Az, which means strength, so does El-Az means God's strength in Hebrew. You can thank me later. Having the generic Hebrew word for God, El, and Az for strength in it. We also have findings of the so-called Nile of the Delta knife, and you can all fact check me on these things, guys, but we also have findings of the so-called Nile Delta. Now, it's a knife, it's an artifact that's found in Greece, and other, like the classic warrior Egyptian helmets, they're found in Greece. What on earth are they doing there? Now, I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt that the Hellenes were the ancient Jewish tribe of Dan, especially if the Spartans themselves mention that. At least the rulers in the beginning were not, but I would say later on were taken over by the ancient Jewish tribe of Dan, because the appearing of the Phoenician script in the Balkans coincides with the Assyrian occupation of Israel, which would kind of logically follow that there were some Hebrew people that ran away from that occupation, so on and so forth. Now, if that is so, if it is beyond a reasonable doubt that the Hellenes were the ancient Jewish tribe of Dan, then this way, I will say that this created something like a Samaritan type of conglomerate in the Balkans, known as the Elii, or later known as Hellenes. This way, Macedonians and some Egyptians, we have records that some Egyptians participated in the Olympics. If they had Hebrew origin from their female lineage, Hebrew identity was and is established from the female side by their tradition, still is. This is a fact. This way, one could state that Macedonians had Hellenic, which means Hebrew in essence, roots by not neglecting their Gentile or Macedonian identity, and vice versa, hence they could partake in the Olympics. You can thank me later. This would mean that the Hellenes would have been of Semitic origin, and as the ancient Jewish tribe of Dan, living in Egypt and Babylon and Assyria or Arcadia for centuries, they have accepted part of their language, which part of the Egyptian, part of the Babylonian languages, for which the Jews language which was Semitic in nature. An example of this is the term for something bad, for which the Jews used the Egyptian word ra and still use it till this day. It is well known in Egypt in ancient times about the eagerness of the ancient Jews to adapt local customs and go even beyond in modification of those local customs that they encountered. Hence, when we break down the name Alexandu in Semitic, coming from the Hittite records for Alexander, we have Al, Semitic for God, Aksa, the farthest or the latest, Du, which from Akkadian it means to bring in or to create. So the Hellenic name Alexander, we have the original Macedonian name read in the middle text of the Rosetta Stone. I'll talk about that later. But the Hellenic name of Alexander, or Alexandu, is actually a Semitic name that means the latest created god. You following me so far? Now, the Macedonian name for Alexander, found in the recently deciphered middle text of the Rosetta Stone as Ancient Macedonian Slavian language, had the same context. Naibogen, or the most divine, which is God, a god. So we have the same context, which is in Macedonian, in ancient Macedonian, is the most divine, which would mean he is a god. We also find in the middle text, in the middle Macedonian text of the Rosetta Stone, that Naibogen, or Alexander, and other Macedonian rulers were compared as young created heavenly souls, which would completely coincide with the Hellenic Semitic meaning of Alexander or Alexandu, the latest created god. So we have young created heavenly souls, Naibogeni, which would mean the latest created gods. This, I would say truth is stranger than 19th century romanticized propaganda. Don't you agree?